I was saying we are particularly pleased to have with us today Gisèle Sapiro, who is going to talk to us about the unequal condition of the circulation of ideas. So let me briefly introduce her. So Gisèle Sapiro is a professor of sociology at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and she is a director of research at the CNRS. She is a specialist of sociology of culture, literature, intellectuals, and the history of humanities and social sciences. She recently coordinated the Dictionnaire International Pierre Bourdieu, a reference work with more than 600 entries and a formidable pedagogical tool. I don't know if this dictionary will be translated in English.
Into English, I don't know. It is going to be translated into Arabic and Turkish.
Oh, great.
Perhaps Spanish.
Oh, so Gisèle is also a specialist of Pierre Bourdieu's work, and she attended to the conference organized by Roland Lardinois and Meenakshi Tapan in 2004. It was a tribute to Pierre Bourdieu, who had just passed away. So she wrote one of the chapters of the book that resulted of this conference, titled "Reading Pierre Bourdieu in a Dual Context," and published by Routledge, India. So among her many other important publications, Gisèle also recently edited an important book, Ideas and Moves in the Social Sciences and Humanity, the International Circulation of Paradigms and Theories. So I can show the cover of the book, but we are very sorry because we ordered the book more than 1 month ago. And very recently, 2 days ago, our supplier just informed us that the book has been lost in transit. So the book, I don't know if maybe you can make a zoom, Nero? No.
Just to tell you that Paragraph outsources all the work of editing in India.
Okay.
It's part of the division of labor, international division of labor.
Okay, so before I hand over to Gisèle, I would like to explain very briefly why I felt it was important to discuss this work and specifically at the CSH. So I read this book when I arrived. So it was 1 year ago, and I was immediately attracted by the different aspects of this work. And I will try now to develop a little 3 aspects of this work. First of all, as you know, CSH is a multidisciplinary laboratory, and I could add a laboratory in which the disciplines are in constant dialogue, and it is rare enough to be underlined. So all the research developed here questions the theoretical framework that are mobilized to understand the social fact studied. What theoretical tools are used? Are the theoretical frameworks forged in a Western context useful for analyzing Indian realities? What theoretical frameworks are available here? And where do they come from? So it seemed to me that this type of reflection to which the book provides many answers, is shared by all the researchers within CSH and could almost constitute a transversal axis of research, or at least a common reflection. The second point, I was seduced by the materialist approach that is developed in this book. So in contrast to diffusionist or imitative, mimetic approaches, and also in contrast to disembodied history of ideas, even of ideas, to quote Marx, this book questioning is a part of an historical sociology of ideas, centered focus on the materiality of the condition of circulation. So what the different chapters of this book do provide is an analysis of the work of circulation, the contribution of the worker, and above all, the institution involved in this process. For example, the chapter on the international diffusion of Gramsci thought shows how the collapse of the Italian Communist Party, which had some control over the author's work, allowed other currents, such as subaltern studies, to appropriate it. So the CSH and the Book Office at the heart of these processes and have a formidable observatory of all these operations that lead to the materialization of ideas. So they are in contact with translators, publishers, journalists, editorialists, academics, etc. It will be an interesting challenge to take on the task of sociologically documenting these processes in the coming years. And third point, and I will end with that, the book immediately raises the question of the inequalities that social sciences works encounter in their circulation. Last evening, Gisèle Sapiro brilliantly showed that Annie Ernaux had a strong chance of winning the Nobel Prize of Literature, given her publisher, Gallimard, given the position of France in the international literacy space, given as French is a central language, etc. But at the same time, she pointed many obstacles, being a woman, writing about working class and symbolic gender violence, made this consecration more unlikely. So in the book, an extremely interesting reflection is made on the specific context, or rather field of production, to quote Bourdieu, within which works are produced as works, and those in which they are received. And authors such as Gramsci, for instance, may have been the object of attempts at the appropriation by French far right. Texts do not take their field of production with them, and the reappropriation of works depends on the structure of the field of reception. So this theoretical framework opens up a huge program of research. I would like to mention a few research questions among many others. First, what is the political and scientific context of the country of importation? Second, what are the position and strategy of the actors involved in the importation operations? How is the editorial space structured? What is the weight of commercial publishers, activist publisher? What is the hierarchy of discipline in the social sciences? How strong are the academy, I mean the institution in charge of defending the canon within the disciplines? What is the autonomy of academics? What is the state of academic freedom? Is there an independent press? Gisèle Sapiro invites us to take this program seriously and to go further, to try to reconstruct the trajectory of works within the global space of social sciences. It is a very huge program she outlined here, which raises many questions, and I will now give her the floor. Thank you, Gisèle, for coming, and we are now listening to you.
Thank you so much, Odile, for this great institution, and thanks again to you, to CSH, and to the French Institute, and to Julia for bringing me here and have the opportunity to share this research program, which is indeed just in the beginning. I mean, there's so much to do, and it's a global program somehow. So I will give some elements of the research I'm conducting now on these topics, and then I think you opened many questions that can be discussed. So I hope we can discuss that. I'm not sure they can show the speaker. So usually it should show the.
There is no Zoom possible, no?
In principle, there should be, but okay. No, you can. Okay, you can leave it here. So I start anyhow. Important is the slideshow and what I'm saying. So the common belief within the academic field and outside is that knowledge circulates under the control of academics who validate it on the basis of scientific principle, and that it then becomes common knowledge. The sociology and history of science have since the 1970s challenged this ironic view of the establishment and circulation of knowledge by uncovering social factors and power relations. Still, the implication of this approach for the understanding of the conditions of international circulation of ideas have not been fully investigated and acknowledged. Within the academic field, the international circulation of ideas occurs in specific settings, mainly conferences, journals, and books. This is just the map of the Unequal project I mentioned, so you don't have to focus on that. So within the academic field, the international circulation of ideas occurs in specific settings, mainly conferences, journals, and books. Drawing from Bourdieu's seminal paper on the social conditions for the international circulation of ideas that Odile reminded us about, and from his field theory, as well as from my former work, this presentation examines a set of factors which favor or impede the transnational circulation of ideas in the social and human sciences. And I focus on asymmetries which are often ignored or worse, considered as scientifically rather than socially grounded. These asymmetries will be observed at 3 different levels. I think we can go to the next slide. So where's it doesn't correspond anyhow. These asymmetries can be observed at 3 different levels: international associations, with the case of the International Sociological Association, the building of the canon, and the circulation of academic books. I think we can go to the next one. Next slide, please. Yeah, no, not yet. So, okay. You can leave it anyhow. So these asymmetries, as I said, would be observed at 3 different levels: international association, the building of the canon, and the circulation of academic books in translation. In these 3 cases, I will try to show the social factors such as nationality and gender, which play a role in these asymmetries of circulation and also of acknowledgement or ascription of ideas to authors. To understand the social conditions for the circulation of ideas in the SSH, we first need to describe the structure of the space where they circulated, and to adapt for this purpose Bourdieu's field theory, which was conceived at a national level. The nationalization of the, I don't know, something's wrong with the problem, but the nationalization and the social and human sciences and their academic institutionalization, which occurred for sociology, for instance, but also for anthropology, political science, economics, and psychology in most countries after the Second World War, so I'm speaking of academic institutionalization, were accompanied by the production of scholarly work in the national languages and by the creation of national journals. I don't know why this is not the, something's wrong with the PowerPoint. Yeah, I mean, no, it's okay. The previous one, please. Yeah. So you can see here, I can't see much, I'm sorry, but it's the former one, please. So that's the Sociological Association, and you can see that most of them were founded after 1949, when the International Sociological was founded. So we usually think of internationalization from the national to the international, but actually the academic institutionalization and the creation of the professionalization occurred in many cases after. So I'm interested in the role of this international association in the establishment of national disciplines. And you see, it was accompanied by the creation of journals. So maybe the journals is the next one, or it's the following up of the, I can't see. So I think it's still the association. Do we have the journals afterward? No, okay. Let's go back. It's maybe not be the, okay. This academic institutionalization of the social and human sciences that we studied in the European project Interco SSH, International Cooperation in the Social Sciences and Humanities, for 8 countries, was in fact, and as I will show in the case of sociology, fostered by the foundation of the International Association at the instigation of UNESCO, which expected from them to favor international dialogue and a better mutual understanding among the people after the war, and also to provide knowledge for public policies. By the same token, this association also favored the formation of international disciplinary fields, so not only the national, but also international disciplinary fields, and also their regionalization, a phenomenon that has been studied by my colleague Johanna Heilbronn, which was the result of this internationalization. So for instance, the Latin American Association for the Social Science, ALAS, was founded at the same moment in 1949, or 1 year after, 1950, after ISA, International Sociological Association. The Nordic Association was founded in 1955 and launched the journal Acta Sociologica, and they favored the establishment of the Swedish and Danish associations, respectively in 62 and 65. And the European Association is latest, only 92, in close relationship to the establishment of the EU on the basis of the Maastricht Treaty. So you can see also the political issues at stake. These international fields are unified not only by these associations, but also by the international competition for the imposition of the norms of the discipline, its canon, its legitimate theories and methods. So this competition occurred in an uneven space, which has been largely dominated by some centers in terms of concentration of power, economic, culture, scientific, and so on, mainly the US, the UK, France, and Germany, in the case of sociology, with a varying weight according to the discipline. The US being, for instance, dominant in sociology, whereas Germany and France were in philosophy, or also in sociology before World War II. While the national journals of peripheral countries are read only nationally, those of the centers are more read internationally. And again, center and periphery is here a descriptive tool to map the space we are talking about, where is produced the knowledge that is imposed upon the other places. So it's power relation. It's not just kind of normative or something. It's not at all normative. So, and I think it's important to have in mind, because we never think about it, all these journals produced in many countries that are never read by anybody, and most people should have read American Journal of Sociology or whatever. Of course, you are a specialist in an area and you read the journals in the country, and this is a specific situation we can discuss later. So I will try to briefly show first how these uneven power relations are manifested in the International Sociological Association organization and congresses, based on the research I'm conducting on this association currently, before turning to the making of the canon and then to book translations. So now we can switch to the next slide. So in my previous work in the Interco SSH project, I distinguished 4 different processes. So this was the first, emergence of a scientific field, professional development, academic institutionalization, the formation of a subfield of scholarly publishing. So these are the 4 dimensions. And I think these processes usually are considered as one. And I think we should observe them separately. Formation of an academic field, a scientific field, academic discipline, institutionalization, professionalization, and the construction of a scholarly subfield of publishing. Because, for instance, sociology emerged as a scientific field in France by the end of the 19th century, as shown by Victor Carradé and also by Johan Elborn in his recent book, but was not institutionalized as an academic discipline until 1958. Think of also psychoanalysis, which developed as a profession, but did not achieve academic institutionalization in most countries. So the convergence of these four processes was fostered by the international associations created after the war, as the case of the ISA shows. So in the first period of its existence from 1950 to 1970, the ISA played a central role in these four processes at an international level, but also at a national one. The ISA was then composed only of collective members, delegates from the national associations or from institutions that could help establish the discipline in the country. It was really international because each country was represented by delegates. ISA encouraged national initiative, try to contact sociologists in countries that were not affiliated to ISA and to help them establish the discipline in the country. So again, I'm speaking about sociology because I'm studying this case, but I think it happened in other disciplines. Most countries adopted the model of the association. Some of them, including the American one, changed their names and status from learned societies to association. We saw that in the slide earlier. So DiMaggio and Powell explained that isomorphism of organizations can be explained by three alternative processes: constraint, imitation, and the circulation of professional norms. So constraint, we can think of the communist regime, how the model was constrained of organization in the academic field. Imitation, you can see when countries one go to the other to see how they organize some institution. But in our case, what is interesting is that the third option is the circulation of professional norms that ISA contributed to and which contributed to the homogenization of the disciplinary model across the world. ISA set up and circulated the research agenda, teaching and professional norms, to which a section was dedicated in the first congresses. So there were sessions on these topics, and it helped disseminate also findings through its congresses and its journal, Current Sociology, and the UNESCO journal, International Social Science, Bulletin, and also the publications of the proceedings of the congresses. However, in this phase, ISA was not entirely autonomous from the UNESCO political agenda. From the start, ISA gathered sociologists from many countries. The second ISA World Congress, so you can see the World Congresses here, the representation per region. The second ISA World Congress in Liège, 53, attracted 281 delegates from 34 countries. So 65 from Belgium, 34 from the US, 32 from France, 28 from Germany, 23 from the UK, 22 from the Netherlands, 8 from Italy, 7 from Denmark, 7 from India. There were also, so Indian sociologists were present from the start in the institution. There were also representatives from Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Ecuador, Finland, Gold Coast, Greece, Iceland, Israel, Japan, Lebanon, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, Panama, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Union of South Africa, Uruguay, Venezuela, and Yugoslavia. It's important to see the scope. It was less than the Indian presence, but to see that it was really international. The Congress raised the question of how to collectively circulate the 156 papers that were presented in the two official languages, which were English and French. It also raised the question of how to articulate oral presentations of research papers with their publication, and whether they should be published individually, collectively, or to split into themes. So all these kind of questions that we ask ourselves when we organize conferences. The alternative between different outlets is also significant. Publishing in academic journals privileged scientific communication towards a specialized community. ISA had just launched the first issue of its journal, Current Sociology, for trend reports on different topics such as urban sociology, industrial and rural sociology, the impact of industrialization on underdeveloped countries, assimilation of immigrants, electoral sociology, the sociology of family, religion, criminology, and so on. The journal was published in collaboration with UNESCO and the International Committee in the Social Sciences. However, the collaboration with UNESCO opened the path to policy sociology, and the ISA signed a contract to evaluate the studies produced by UNESCO in the Tensions project and to suggest new lines in the sociology of international relations, which was more a domain of political science, but sociologists wanted also to be implicated in that. The ISA also collaborated with UNESCO on studies about the teaching of sociology in 15 countries that were published in the UNESCO series, Teaching in the Social Sciences. The proceedings of the second Congress, especially the first volume, which included surveys on recent research trends in different countries, training and professional issues, asserted in turn the discipline as such in the international academic field, the sociological discipline, at a crucial point of its professionalization and academic institutionalization. The transactions, that the publications of the proceedings, were opening a series which would include the proceedings of the following meetings. I would like now to focus on asymmetries between countries and gender. So I hope it's the next slide. Yeah, I would like to focus now on the executive committee over time. And so we did this research with Mauricio Bustamante, my former PhD student. No, so sorry, not with Alihan Meski, my current PhD student. With Mauricio, it was the other, sorry. We looked at the executive committee over time. And as you can see, it was large. So there is work done by Jennifer Platt on ISA, and we have followed, but I'm reworking on the ISA congresses because her history was more institutional history. So we looked at the executive committee over time, and it was largely dominated by European and American scholars who accounted for 2/3 to 3/4 of the members until 2006, when it fell to less than a half, while the share of Asian members started rising. Africa is still underrepresented. So one member from Nigeria and one from South Africa, more recently one from Tunisia. A similar observation can be made about RC boards, so that's the next slide, with the rise of East Asian members starting in 2006. The next slide, please. No. This is executive committee. It's the, yeah, sorry, it's not going until the end. So this is the research committee boards. So you can see the same scheme, the same pattern of inequality of representation, despite, as you saw, presence of many other countries. A voluntary policy has been implemented offering lower fees for global south countries. So this was a very important instrument in trying to rebalance. So 3 categories according to the level of income in the country and so on. The language question was debated in the 1982 Congress in Mexico, when Latin American scholars protested that there were no sessions in Spanish. Spanish was added as an official language in ISA in 1994. And in the forum in Porto Alegre held online, automatic translation was used and some papers were presented in Portuguese. In 1994, some RCs had reported on growing numbers from Asia, but sub-Saharan Africa was still hardly represented, if at all. None in the RC 34 Sociology of Youth, while 18% was composed of members from Asian countries. One in RC 21, Urban and Regional Development. This is now not the boards, but the RCs themselves. 13 from Asia, few African scholars in RC 14, Sociology of Communication, Knowledge and Culture. Now we can go to the next slide. Yes, some RCs seem, however, to have first been more attractive to scholars from the Global South countries. RC 28, Social Stratification, reported on the following numbers. US 129, Netherlands 30, you have it, I won't spell it out. And RC 31, Sociology of Migration, which attracted scholars from Africa. So this is for 1994. The sociological abstracts started in 1995. So that was also a tool to attempt to overcome the geographic and linguistic asymmetries within the ISA, so to disseminate the sociological abstracts. Now to gender. Despite the fact that women participated since the first Congress until 1970, there were almost no women among the executive committee members, nor among the RC boards. One entered the executive committee in 1974. One was secretary of the psychiatric sociology RC. One joined the board of the poverty, social welfare and social policy RC in 1968. Even in the 70s and 80s, the RC board members counted very few women, except for the Women, Gender and Society RC, which was not yet called. It started in 74 as sex roles and then became Women in Society, and then became in the 90s Women, Gender and Society. And it was created, launched by a group of female sociologists and has attracted almost no men to date. In the family RC, a woman became, for the first time, a member of the board in 1970, and the number of women grew, exceeding that of men after 1990. The board of the newly born Education RC, founded by Pierre Bourdieu in 1971, counted 2 women when it was launched, and the board. And the Leisure RC board 3 in 74. So you can see that it's also topic related, because of course in rational theory or law there are very, very few women still, sociology of law. So in 1984, Else Øyen from Norway had stressed in the meeting of the program committee that there should be more female representation, and she said 84. And she seconded with Stella Kwa from Singapore a motion to encourage session organizers to invite scholars from the third world, and it was called third world at the time, and female scholars to present papers at the 11th World Congress. The motion was extended to other underprivileged groups to ensure, quote, the largest possible representation of the sociological community as a whole. Among the women in the program committee then was Margaret Archer, who would be elected at the 12th Congress of '86, first female president of ISA. The second female president since then was Margaret Abraham, who is also a feminist activist. She's from Indian origin, but working in the US, and she was elected in 2014. It is telling that, like for the Global South, this evolution resulted from a voluntary policy to correct the gender and cultural biases and asymmetries produced by the uneven power relations within the global disciplinary field. And this means that it is reproduced unconsciously, systematically, if you don't have a policy. The feminization of RC boards has been uneven across the RCs. I think we can go to the next. I'm not sure. No, that's not. So I don't have a slide for women. Can go back here. The feminization of RC board has been uneven across the RCs since the 70s and in strong correlation to gender topics. So women, family, education, leisure versus, as I said, politics or law. It was not until 1990 that a woman joined the law and sociology board, and there was only one until 2006, when the number of women started growing and when a French woman became president of the law sociology board. In political sociology board, the first woman appeared in 1994. In the stratification RC board, there had been only one woman from Norway until 1990, and in 1990 an Australian woman joined. In 94, one from Taiwan, and in 2010 the number of women became close to the number of men. So this better representation of female sociologists in RC board is thus a very recent phenomenon of the 2 past decades, reflecting the feminization of the discipline. In the third forum held in Vienna, Forum of Sociology 2016, more than 56% of the registered participants were women. So for a number of 4,231 participants. And the access of women to higher positions in academia, full professorship and academic leadership contributed to this. But it may also have followed the models of the American and British associations. So I think that the models that there were more feminization there and more pressure for feminization in these American and British association had an influence on the ISA. So they had female members had advocated since the 70s there for a better representation in their activities and governance. I want to add something that sometimes it is said that feminization would be contradictory with the diversity. I mean, diversifying if you go, you introduce more countries and especially more global South countries, it will be contradictory to the feminization. And that is not true. If you look at the ISA, the most invested women were from India, from Brazil, and from Singapore, I mentioned. So they were also from Norway and from other countries, but it's not contradictory. These asymmetries were not only reflected on an organizational level, but even more clearly on the level of the plenary and semi-plenary sessions of the World Congresses, which are crucial for the circulation of ideas, because that's the place where, you know, somebody's invited to speak to all the association members. So that's the crucial place for the circulation of ideas, concepts, and theories, as well for determining the agenda of the discipline. The feminization of the plenary and semi-plenary session was even slower, despite the recommendations made by the program committee, who at least since 1993 explicitly recommended to secure gender representation and geographical diversity of invited speakers. Even when it happened, the asymmetry can still be observed at the level of the division of labor between theory and empirical research, and between topics. For instance, in the 1998 Congress in Montreal, whose theme was social knowledge, heritage, challenges, perspective. So it was to celebrate ISA's 50th birthday. The first of the 6 symposia was the most theoretical. It was entitled Changing Identities and Social Order. It was coordinated by Piotr Skąpka and Klaus Hofe. So Piotr Skąpka would become or had been president of ISA. US scholars were largely dominant in this symposium, with 12 scholars in one symposium from the US. The other ones coming from the UK, 2, Germany 2, Italy 1, Canada 2, India 1, Egypt 1. The most diverse was the symposium on unequal development, causes and consequences. It was coordinated by Samir Naim Ahmed from Egypt and Kokichi Shoji, Japan. And it addressed the core periphery model with 3 scholars from Japan and 1 from Argentina, Brazil, Egypt, Italy, Korea, Mexico, Portugal, Russia, Spain, the US, and Venezuela. But there were only 3 women which took part in this one. While women, of course, were much more represented in the symposium on the quality of modern life, chaired by 2 women, Eva Bley from Sao Paulo and Rena Roth from Germany. These asymmetries are even more visible in the 5 sessions of authors meet readers. So sessions for inviting an author who just published an important book to meet their readers. The proposed names for these sessions include very few female sociologists. Margaret Archer, former president, was invited in 2006. Saskia Sassen was suggested for the 2010 Congress, but I don't think she came. 2 names out of 6 were mentioned for the 2014 Congress, Raquel Gutierrez and Kalpana Kanabiran. So she's Indian. And there was also a prize that was established, the Matei Dogan Prize for Sociology, and it was awarded 3 times based on the nomination by a search committee. The first laureate was Niels Melzer from the United States. The second was Alain Touraine, so from France, and the third was Jeffrey Alexander from the United States. 3 men, 2 American, 1 French. This prize was then discontinued, and in 2014, ISA created an award for excellence in research and practice, which was first awarded to former ISA president Emanuel Wallerstein, and in 2018, it was awarded, granted to Nira Yuval Davis from University of East London, so a woman, thus reflecting the feminization of ISA at that moment. This leads me to the canon building. So the marginalization of women in science is not a new topic, and the ascription to subaltern roles is now starting to be well researched. Moreover, scientific discoveries they may have made were frequently attributed to men, like in the case of medical doctor Marthe Gauthier, who was the true discoverer of trisomy. In the canon of the SSH, there were very few women, and are still very few. So in anthropology, at least you have Margaret Mead and maybe Germaine Tillon, but who remembers Dina Dreyfus, who was Claude Lévi-Strauss' wife and did all the trips in Brazil and the missions. So Dorothy Ross has shown that the professionalization of American sociology in the 1920s operated by the exclusion of social work, which meant the exclusion of all the women. But despite the refeminization of the profession, in the afterwar period, no woman has been included in the sociological canon. The situation is a little different for ethnic minorities, people of color, and global South sociologists who have also been marginalized or excluded from the canon, because now there is a rediscovery, for instance, of the Afro-American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, who has been rediscovered and is becoming now internationally consecrated. His books are being translated or retranslated. And last year, the former president of ISA and of ASA, Michael Burawoy, dedicated, it was 2 years ago, no, it was last year, dedicated a paper to his, to Du Bois at the closing plenary session of the ISA forum in Porto Alegre under the title Decolonizing Sociology. So with the idea to really revise the canon. In the debate on Western hegemony, some sociologists in India, China, Egypt, Turkey reject the Western canon, as you know, better than I do here, and promote indigenous tradition and authors such as Ibn Khaldun. I shall not address this debate here, but we can discuss it during the discussion. I think Ibn Khaldun is worthwhile reading for what I've read of him. But even without going back that far, there were sociologists active in the global South since the interwar period. And for instance, Radha Kamal Mukherjee and Durjati Prasad Mukherjee were two important sociologists. Whether they are worthwhile being rediscovered can be decided only after reading them, which doesn't happen in Western, the so-called Western countries. So it is also important to acknowledge that the canon of the discipline was not built nationally, but through cultural contacts and transnational exchanges. In sociology, despite the fact that, the discipline was much less institutionalized there as an academic discipline than in the US, the German and French traditions were dominant until the 60s. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. If you look at the Engram viewer, you can see that Auguste Comte was, after Karl Marx, the most cited foreign sociologist in English until the mid-30s, when Max Weber replaced him at the second place, but Comte continued to be a steady reference until the mid-60s. As we know, Max Weber was introduced in the US by Talcott Parsons, who had discovered his work while he was doing his PhD in Heidelberg in the 20s. And he had translated some of his pieces, and Parsons, who was one of the first instructors at the newly founded Department of Sociology at Harvard, also contributed to establishing Durkheim, whose work was introduced in the US since the end of the 19th century. But he became really a canonical reference in American sociology after Parsons established him. And Durkheim is a major reference in Parsons' structure of social action, published in 1937, just before the English translation of Les Règles de la méthode sociologique. After the war, the translations of Durkheim's work were reprinted, and his centennial was celebrated in 1959. In the 60s, 89% of the introductory text to the discipline mentioned Durkheim, and a flow of monographs and articles were dedicated to his thought and showed by, as showed by Jennifer Platt. Durkheim has emerged as one of the Holy Trinity, as we say in sociology, or Bierstedt puts it this way, and by 1970, as the most the second most important sociological reference in English after Weber. At the time, American sociology had become dominant in the transnational sociological field, and Durkheim's canonization in the US may have contributed to his canonization in France, at least partly, because he had been combated by the authoritarian Vichy regime during World War II and was rejected by the elite students at the École Normale Supérieure. And Bourdieu remembered that when he was student philosophy, Durkheim was something that you should not, I mean, you read, but it was considered that something to reject. And his canonization was also undertaken by Bourdieu and Caradi. After Bourdieu became a sociologist and launched his series Le Sens Commun, Victor Caradi edited, so a Hungarian exile, edited the 3-volume of Durkheim and Mauss, 3 volumes of Mauss also, who presented different Durkheim than the Pearsonian structural functionalism. So there was a war of appropriation of Durkheim at that moment, because Lazarfest was being introduced in France and with the positivist model. Durkheim's work had also been introduced since the end of the 19th century in other countries like Brazil, and sociology was taught there starting in the 1920s in the École Normale, like in France, and his Principios de Sociologia, in his Principios de Sociologia 1935, Fernando de Azevedo, who held the first chair of sociology at the University of São Paulo and founded the Brazilian Sociological Society, established Durkheim as a major canonical reference, along with Zimmel and Pareto, and he published the first Portuguese translation of Les Règles de la méthode sociologique in his series in 1937, before the English, which came out in 1938, before the Japanese, which came out in 1942, before the German, which came out in 1961, and before the Italian, which came out in 1963. So you can see that it's not at all a European story, this canonization of Durkheim. But of course, Durkheim's sociology was also taught through textbooks. One of them was Walter Sproat's Sociology, in which Durkheim is the first reference cited on the 5th line, after an opening quote by Maurice Ginsberg defining sociology. And Weber appears on the 3rd page, after Linton and Hayek. And I also found a Hebrew translation of this book of Walter Sproat, published in 1955 in a popular science book series in Hebrew. So this brings me to the issue of translation, and will be my last point. To end, I would like to show the asymmetries, that asymmetries play a role in the selection of scholarly books which gets translated, and Odile already alluded to that. Since the journals are nationally based, apart from a few of them edited in the centers of this this global field, and since the SSH journals seldom publish translated articles, as you know, only classical or seminal papers, and since only a small fragment of scholars manage to publish directly in English, or in most countries, not here, of course, or in other vehicular languages, the international circulation of scholarship depends in large part on book translations. So what scholarly books circulate in translation and why? So I hope the next slide is okay. Oh, this was the Hebrew, the Walter Sproat, so sorry. Yeah, so based on the quantitative analysis of translation flows into French and of French books into English, so I've databases and analyzed them. I have identified 6 sets of factors which favor or hinder the translation of scholarly books. So power relation between languages and cultures, symbolic capital and other properties of the author, properties of the book, symbolic capital of the publisher, networks, and funding. Some of them are specific to this category of book, scholarly books. Others are characteristic of upmarket translations, and still others are derived more generally from the power relations structuring the global book market. So I will focus here on the two first. The first factor affecting translation is the centrality of the language. And again, it's a descriptive category, as Abraham de Swan has described in his word system of languages. He shows that the most central languages are those who are spoken as a secondary language. Otherwise, you cannot explain why Chinese, which is one of the most spoken language in the world, is so scarcely translated compared to translations from English. So this is the measure of centrality, the flows of translation for me here in other languages, because Johan Elbron has adapted this model of center periphery used by this one for the system of languages to the flows of translation, and to look at the flows of translation. And we have done a lot of work together, and I have more specifically also worked on translation of scholarly books that I'm presenting here. So works written in central languages, that is to say English, French, and German, are proportionally more often translated than others. So in this, the database of translations into French from 11 languages between, you can show the next slide, between 85 and 2000. Yeah, here are the global flows of translation into French, not global, but from 11 languages from 1985 to 2002. It's precise because we have to stop the database somewhere. So it's all the books published, translated from these languages into French, which appeared between 85 and 2002. So you can see that English accounted for 53%, followed by German, Italian, Spanish, Russian, and all other languages were inferior to 1.5%. In the following decade, the gap between English and German has widened. On a database of 2,560 translations from 3 languages, English, German, and Italian, English concentrated 2/3 of the translations, whereas German fell to 22% and Italian to 12%. However, this figure, so you can see that the same pattern of power relations between languages appear in scholarly books, but there is a relative autonomy of the subfield of scholarly publishing, because the translations from English into French are much more than 50%. It's 2/3. It's even more. It's more than 2/3. And for instance, German and Italian are less than they are in the social sciences. And then you can see that it's related to the social capital, the symbolic capital associated with the intellectual tradition of scholarly books, like German philosophy, for instance. And then we will get more specifically into what is translated. So this is this measure of symbolic capital of a national tradition, yeah, intellectual national tradition. So now let's talk about the international symbolic capital of the author, which can be related to the former factors, but acts as an independent variable. So I hope it's the next. Yes, I can't see the title. Problem is, yes, so here you have the disciplines, I think, and I just can't read the. Okay, so here you have the disciplines. I'm sorry, I don't see well. Now, if we consider the international symbolic capital of the author, it's an independent variable, because it encapsulates in the name of the author all this symbolic capital. So meaning that most of his or her work will be translated. So like classical authors, Kant. So it is also in many cases relatively independent from the content of the book itself, right? Why should we translate Kant? It's not a question. This book of Kant, it's not a question. So these authors have, having achieved the status of classic, are endowed with a great amount of symbolic capital. We can think also of Descartes. And let's go to the next slide. The next. Yeah, this one. So it is also true of authors in the process of being canonized, like the authors of French theory, Foucault and Derrida. You can see the translations of their books into English. This is another database. So between 2002 and 2012, you can see that Badiou, Cixous, Derrida, Jean-Luc Nancy, Rancière are the most translated, and you can find Bourdieu, although he already died and most all of his books were translated into English, but there are still new translations coming out. And this is also a property of classical authors that they continue to produce after the death. I just the former slide, just a minute. I showed it at IIC the other day. No, the one on Mathieu effect. No, it's afterwards. No, after. Yes, this one. So you can see that the Mathieu effect of translation that I showed for Bourdieu, that at some point being translated leads to being translated. And this is where you see that the proper name functions as a kind of symbolic capital in and all of itself, a kind of brand name. So now to the next slide, please. Yeah, so now I compared the titles translated into French from English, French, and German between 2003 and 2013, according to the period when the author wrote. We have to enter this data, it's never in the database, so it's a lot of work, but then you can see that we distinguish classical authors before the 20th century, like Kant, authors who are modern classics or on their way to enter the canon, the process to which translation contributes, like Edward Said, and contemporary authors who were alive in the period of reference, like Agamben or Butler. And it appears that while most translations from English and Italian are books by contemporary authors, 2/3 of the translations from German are by dead authors. And this indicates, of course, that the past symbolic capital of German social sciences and philosophy is still valued, but also that this symbolic capital was not transferred to contemporary authors, although there are some like Habermas, Axel Honneth, and Ulrich Beck. Accumulation of international symbolic capital depends in large part on other social properties of the author that impact her chance to be translated. And I mentioned gender already before, and this is true also for translation. It's also education, holding a PhD from a prestigious university or school, country of residence, central versus peripheral in the global field of the SSH, institutional affiliation, elite institution like Oxbridge or the Ivy League, international social capital in the academic and intellectual fields. So I'll focus on gender. Books authored by men seem to have a clear advantage over those authored by women, as you can see. Books authored by women account for only 12% of the titles in translation from English into French, the lowest share being German, 5.7%, and we have Hannah Arendt inside, so there's not much room left, versus 13.4 for English and 14.6 for Italian. The share from French into English is 15%. So English, I would say, is the most open language to translation of books authored by women. So this is 15%. And if we go to living authors, 20%. This percentage is much lower than in the domain of literary fiction that I have studied also for the same period. For literary fiction, it was 1/4 of the books translated from French in the United States in the 1990s that were authored by women. So 1/4, and that share rose to 1/3 among contemporary living authors. Whereas, so twice as much as in the social sciences, whereas among scholarly books, this percentage rose only to 20%, as I said, of the titles by translated authors who were alive until 2003. Of course, this result should be compared to the gender ratio in the original language, which we don't have. This data is not available, but we even though we can consider that probably male scholars produce more books than female scholars, we can consider also the fact that women account for, now today in France, 27 to 45% of the university professors in the social sciences and the humanities. So it seems plausible that to consider that they are underrepresented in the international circulation of scholarly books, like at the level of full professorships. So just to conclude now, I have showed that the international circulation of ideas does not happen randomly or only on the basis of scientific criteria, but reveal patterns of unequal power relations which structure the global academic field between the North and the global South, between men and women, and between the dominant ethnic groups and the others. These power relations underlie international associations and their congresses, as illustrated by the case of ISA. They underlie the canonization process, and they underlie the translation flows. The ISA has implemented a voluntary policy to correct these asymmetries, and it seems to have worked. There are more Global South and female scholars in the executive board now, in the RC boards as well, the plenary and semi-plenary sessions, and they have more opportunities to access consecration, prizes, invitations for a book launch. So this means that it was a struggle. It was not just a voluntary policy. The voluntary policy was the result of a struggle. So this means that to correct the linguistic, and also the attempts to correct the linguistic asymmetries are still very limited, of course. But whereas the literary and art canon and the international circulation of literary and artwork is now being revisited to promote female, minorities and migrants and global South authors or creators or artists, in sociology and other social sciences, social science disciplines, there is still much work to be done. Sociologue, encore un effort. I haven't addressed here the patterns of, and it will be the last slide, the patterns of appropriation that Odile mentioned in her introduction, which are revealed by the case studies developed in the book, because I'm not sure we can have yet something that goes beyond Bourdieu's model, Bourdieu's framework, but I can end with some suggestions for the discussion. And I think, of course, we need much more kind of field study that you suggested to be able to build a model. So Bourdieu has underscored the role of importers and their position in the reception field, and importers here is to underscore the active dimension of importation, and that's the Bourdieu insists on this active dimension, and also he insists, and Odile mentioned that, on the importance of the local stakes within the reception field. So, and we have in the book highlighted not only the scientific, but also the political context. And I think that's also a contribution of the social history of social sciences and humanities studies to the sociology of science, which has not so much taken into account the broader intellectual and political context. Bourdieu also stresses the obstacles, so of course the notion of appropriation is active, echoing Appadurai's work, of course. Bourdieu also stresses the obstacle to the circulation of ideas. So obstacles is something we have to look at to try to understand what circulates, what does not circulate. And also, of course, we can bridge it with Edward Said's idea of conditions of acceptance and resistance. So I can have examples of the reluctance to analytic philosophy in France until the 1990s, which was studied by Romain Pudal. So it was introduced by the margins of the philosophical field and of the publishing field. There is a very small publisher who has kept publishing analytic philosophy. Conversely, in the US, French theory was introduced not in philosophy departments, but in French and English. Other dimension is the flexibility of troubling concepts, and I'm referring to Mieke Bal's article about that, who says that concepts are more flexible than methodology, but she's a human science, and we can say that methodology also circulates, and that's also a question how it circulates, how it is appropriated. And of course, the question of hybridization that was put forward by Edward Said and Omi Baba is an interesting question for the fact that models or theories or paradigms or methodologies are never appropriate mechanically, but in active way, which modify them in the circulation. And I stop there. Sorry if I was a little longer. And thank you, Nero, for the PowerPoint.
I don't know if we can stop maybe 3:15 or
Yeah. Gisèle will have only 15-minute break. So
It's okay.
It's okay.
because we have a second round after this one.
Yeah,
No?
this will be more casual, so I think it's okay.
Okay, because okay, so I don't want to I just will ask one question. I prepare more, but I would prefer that everybody would ask also. Thank you a lot, Gisèle. No, my question was about your methodology and the weight of translation within this work, because it is more in the book than it is given for granted that when a book is translated into English, maybe in these areas, English speaker, it will be disseminated. But in India, I think the good indicator should be the local edition, because the price of books published in Western publisher, English Western publisher, is so high that it is not affordable here. So maybe better than language translation should be the number of publication in social sciences editor in India. And you have also in India a huge trend from the student to go to this semi-legal media, I mean Latin. So yes, but it is, you have to take it in account, because the circulation is also through this semi-legal online library. And the third thing I wanted to say is that in India also you have a tradition of, I mean, activist group like Dalit, they will publish for nothing, it is almost free, some text, and they will distribute when there are meetings and so on. And I remember when Arun Nati Roy has edited Annihilation of Caste from Ambedkar in a very luxurious edition, it was a big scandal from the activists that for them it was like almost free. And there is also a kind of circulation of canonic text through this informal, I think, ways, I don't know. So it was more a question about, it is a theoretical question, but also methodological question. So do we have to focus on translation, only translation, or maybe on the way in our country, in this country, our country also a little bit, the knowledge will circulate. So.
Yeah, thank you, Odile. That's a great question. I want first to say that now there is a whole trend to discuss about the history of copyright that I'm working on as a history of power relations with the centers, what became centers thanks to the appropriation, the monopoly of copyright. So keeping this monopoly and dispossessing the poorer countries of the copyright. So that's totally relevant. The second thing is that, of course, and I have done this work because with some data you have the location with the index translationum, the UNESCO index translationum, you can find where the book was edited, which country the book was edited, and even the publisher. So I have done that for French, translations into French, and I could show that most of the translations into French, 9 out of 10 books are published in France. 85%, so that was for literature, I think, in Paris. And they're supposed to circulate from there, but they don't. And also I've looked at archives, for instance, of translation from French in the US. And I've looked at where they distribute the books. And because we have it's the archive of an agent I won't mention, and you can see where the book is distributed, and you can see that, for instance, usually they have Northern American rights, but they do not actually distribute in Canada. So it can happen that they would sell the rights for the circulation, the distribution of the book in Canada, and as it happens in India as well. It's very difficult to get this data for the session, when you sell the translation to someone else. This we cannot trace. It's only case, I mean, we would need the publisher's archive or the all these. I mean, it's a kind of very complicated methodology, because each database like this, we check them, we check each item, we check the book, the original title, we have some data for sometimes for the publisher, for the translator, but for instance, we had to introduce gender, we had to introduce the period of the author, and these are large data sets, and it's not automatic work at all. And of course, it's only a partial picture, and you're perfectly right to say that. And for me, it's very clear that the former colonies are disadvantaged in this global circulation of books in the market for translations, because the translations do not arrive. I think in Africa it's even much worse than, and also because these countries are still dominated in publishing by the former colonial big conglomerates. This is the reason. So the big paradox is that when I mentioned at the beginning that Palgrave outsources the editing in India. So the editing of this book was made in India, but the book is not arriving. Yes, and the book is not arriving to India 1 month after you ordered it, with the price, which is, I prefer not to mention the price of it. And the things I won't say on record, but off. So there is, it's a real problem, because it's a privatization of knowledge. It's a merchandization of knowledge, and there are economic interest, huge economic interest in that. And it's a real struggle. So I answered more than the methodology, but methodology has to be built for each object of study that we want to. But I think that's a great topic to undertake, the publishing of social sciences in India.
So, yeah.
Il y a plusieurs.
Okay. Julien. Yeah, Julien. Oh. Julien.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm Julien Lévesque. I was at CSH for a few years. I'm now at the University of Zurich. I had a question regarding the language of writing, and I feel perhaps it's something you did mention a bit, but I think one aspect that I felt was missing was whether authors write in their own language, in their mother tongue, or whether they write in English. And I feel in the past decades, probably a much greater number of authors have who are not native English speakers have started writing in English directly. And for example, you mentioned at some point that the translation of German authors from German into French went down proportionally. So, and you interpreted that as the fact that the past symbolic capital of German scholars was higher than the current one. But maybe another hypothesis could be that present-day German scholars tend to write more in English than, say, Italians, which is why there's a greater number of translations of scholarly work from Italian in proportion than from German. So I was wondering if would it be possible in the database to include whether say authors write in their own language or not, in order to apprehend this the dominance of English language in scholarship.
Yeah, thank you very much for it's a very important question. And there are many aspects of it. The first one is that indeed there are scholars who write in English. Usually it's more for articles, but it's also the case for books, especially in small countries. It's not so much the case for German authors, apart from those who are really how to say, more in the internationalized. In each country, each discipline, you will find scholars who are more internationalized and other who are more nationals. There are many publications in German. I spent 1 year at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and a huge production in German. And also, it's not, if a German scholar will publish in English, usually it's not this book that will be translated in other languages. That's also, I think, an issue. And now German scholars publish in English with their own publishers, academic publishers, and they publish also in different languages. And for instance, now I'm participating in a book with a great project led in ERC by Markus Messling about minor universalities. And this book will be edited in French and English. So it's also a way to open to more language diversity for German scholars. I think there is still a huge production in languages that are not English. There are topics that are more locally related, because as you know, not all topics can circulate in the same way. So if you want to publish in an academic journal in English, the share of non-American, or it's not the nationality, it's the institution. If you are not based in a US or UK institution, the chance to publish in an American or UK journal is very low, although everybody wants to. The pressure is very high. And so many do, because it's now the evaluation is based on publishing in these two journals. But of course, there are two problems. It's the problem of the mastery of the language itself and the cost that it represents for people to get and the institutions to get the papers translated when you're not sure that it will get published. And of course the form of writing, because the human and social sciences are not epistemologically and in the writing unified like the natural sciences, and I don't know if it's possible to unify them this way. And we also, economy is largely, but we can be happy to have in France, for instance, there are also here Amartya Sen and the heterodox economists who publish books and not less articles, and who are not publishing in the traditional, the orthodox economic journals. But the unification was at the cost of imposing one scientific positivistic model and excluding all the more critical approaches. So there is a struggle that is more or less won in different disciplines, but the unification of the writing and the writing model format, way of writing an article in English for a sociology journal is very different than in French. Methodologies are different, the way of addressing problems. You need to have 3 hypotheses. I don't know why 3, why not 5? I mean, so yeah, so there are standards like that look scientific, but I'm not sure always that it means that it is more scientific than something else. Thank you.
Very happy that these questions are actually being studied systematically. I'm just wondering whether this, when you started initially with this binary of national and international, would it really hold everywhere? I'm located in India, and I think in some sense you made reference to that. Most of the Indian Academy has been English Academy. All of us, all the respective publications are in English. All of us publish in English.
Yeah, I know.
While if you look at the social science, particularly sociology and its institutionalization in the national context, my own guess is we don't have any data on that. Nearly 70 to 80% of sociology is taught in the local languages, vernacular languages, and they are different languages. It could be Marathi, it could be Tamil, it could be Hindi. And these are languages where people study language, study sociology. Some of them would come to us in JNU or in Delhi to do their postgraduate studies, and they graduate to writing in English. But most of them just read either local textbooks which are written in Hindi, or they try to read our books. Also within these national or nationally institutionalized academies, there has been a kind of elite takeover, in the sense that until recently, for example, Indian Sociological Society would be completely dominated by English-speaking academic. They are not really, even now when proceedings happen, none of the plenaries would have speaker in any language other than English. And English language speakers also then have a wider global connection, right? They are not just national authors. So that's again the point I was trying to make. Say, for example, South Asian Academy. Now, South Asian Academy by definition is global academy, right? Somebody like Arjun Appadurai would like very much that I also read his work and would want to kind of send me whatever he publishes and would want to be circulated here. Some of them also would quote us, but not all of them, right? So there is a kind of anxiety. So they would also want to publish in a journal called Economic and Political Weekly, which is a peculiar Indian journal. Amartya Sen has published in EPW. Everyone who wants to be read in India would also want to be published here. So I was wondering whether if you kind of think of cases like India or other English-speaking countries, or cases like India where the local elite is very big and is also very resourceful, and then it's also internally hierarchical. So when we are talking about India acting global, it is only the academy in Delhi and other metropolitan centers which does their profession in English language, and there are obviously caste dimensions and other kind of regional dimensions. So I was just wondering whether one should kind of think a little more about the way academies have been institutionalized nationally, given their kind of colonial history. I think that is what makes us reasonably good English speaker, and that's why you have editors in Chennai. I also am doing a similar book, and that's also being kind of, you know, it's signed in Germany, but it's being coordinated from Chennai, right? And everyone does that. OUP also has its own kind of, you know, editors in Chennai. And the second point I wanted to make is the emerging kind of globalized tendencies or globalization temptations. For example, Indian Sociological Society publishes a journal called Sociological Bulletin. And 5 years back, it was handed over to the SAGE because they were not able to manage it well. Now, the SAGE is not an Indian agency, it's a corporate agency. So there is a kind of this corporate interest coming into academic publishing, and they are in some sense not only transnational, they are also what we were talking about, dollar priced, right? So which makes those publications inaccessible to the Indian audience. So even I don't think Indian Sociological Society negotiated. Those who are life members, they are given the journal free. But if I want to buy an article and I'm not a member, I'll perhaps have to pay in dollar price for a SAGE article if I have to download it from the website. So I think these are very interesting processes. And I think precisely the kind of question that you have raised of hierarchies, but identities which are more than national and gender could also be relevant. I mean, in India, this question of, you know, caste becomes very relevant. I suppose in South Africa, question of race would be very relevant, or in other kind of, you refer to ethnicity, but ethnicity is also hierarchical in most contexts.
Yes.
So that also could be relevant. And then a question of internal cores and peripheries, which would work through cosmopolitan centers versus the larger national societies, which could be very hierarchical. And in India, we know these are very hierarchical. And actually, India provides a fascinating case for this kind of study. I mean, Economic and Political Weekly emerged as a very interesting kind of counter to colonial dominance. And this was a site where everyone published. Anyone who mattered, wanted to be read in South Asia, not just by social scientists, but also by policymakers, wanted to publish it there. Started as Economic Weekly in 1950s, late 40s, and it has continued to thrive. It's still published every week. And there's a whole section where social scientists publish from different disciplines, right? So I think, but that's also in English language. But now they are trying to translate their journal in local languages. But this question is not even being raised here, right? I mean, this is, we know this is a problem, but just thought I.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gisèle. I really enjoyed your presentation. And that's why I'm asking if I can ask my question now. This is directly a follow-up question to what Surinder has said, at least your first question. I was wondering if there had been any case studies on the role that, so basically it's the question about, qualifying this distinction between international and national actors. I was wondering if there had been some case studies on publishers who come from the global north and have a colonial, were colonial centers, and have opened up branches in the global south and are recognized as, editors, publishers located there. So you mentioned OUP, that's the most obvious example in India, because OUP India, when you say OUP India, you know that you're being published in New Delhi. So it's different from what you mentioned with Palgrave, where the work is done here, but actually it's published, it says that it's published, in Europe. So here OUP India is very much an Indian publisher, but of course it carries some of the prestige associated with Oxford. So how far do these hybrid actors actually transform or affect, the center periphery power relations on an international scale?
Yeah, thanks. Great comments, and it allows me to continue also follow up on the former question that I forgot on my way to fully answer, because there are countries like the Netherlands, where the academic production depends on discipline. For sociology, for instance, the students even don't know now how to write a paper in their own language. So they start, and it's what's happening in France. I talked once with the head of the Maison Française in Oxford, and he was a chemist, and he said, but in our discipline it's the same. The students they're not able to write a paper in chemistry in French, the French students. So there are countries like those and some disciplines where the national language is abandoned. Now, the issue of the different languages that are used in the social sciences is a major issue. I just started with that, but of course, I was discussing what was circulating, and what is circulating is mainly production in 5 languages. It is English, French, German, Italian, a little Spanish. Used to be more Russian, now there is less. Not this year. I mean, since the 89. I remember a French agent who is in charge with bringing French books to Japan, coming and to talk to me to tell me how can I help her think about bringing Japanese social science books to France, because they are not translated, and there is a huge production in Japanese, and they have their own way of doing social sciences. Some of them are international, but it's a small. Now, I think India is an extraordinary laboratory, and I won't dare speak about India because you are here the specialist, but what you mentioned, all this is extremely relevant to know about the history a little about of the Indian sociological society. It's really fascinating, the issue of language there. It's very specific because I think in most countries, in France, can you imagine somebody producing sociology in Breton in Britain? So in France, the French language has totally abolished the relevance of other languages. There is a production of literature, but not of scholarly work. Maybe there is, but we don't know about it. So it's telling, because you know about and of course, but it's relevant, and it's would be very relevant, for instance, for African sub-Saharan countries, where there is also, I think, less than India production with the regional language. We have to call them regional, though the Hindi is national, but the others they are official, but still not the same level. So this is a very interesting. So the fact that there is a production at the national level, of course, and this is in Homo academicus, Bourdieu describes all scientific field, all the academic field as polarized between the national and the international. So there is a history of nationalization of academic institutions, teaching, and also building a kind of national canon. And so the way sociology is taught in France is different from the US. I try to show that there is a common history of circulation, and that this, because today we do as if it goes from the national to the international, and you're totally right. And of course, the core periphery is not only about countries, it's about cities and about institutions, and the more internationalized institution. You take, for instance, Russia, the Vyshka. Now they are laying off all the international scholars, but it was a very, they all work in English, publish in English. Compare that to Lomonosov University, where everything's produced in Russian. So you can see this opposition in all countries, even a country like Russia, where there is most of the production is in Russian, and there is a very established tradition of social sciences. So national and international actors, that's really interesting. We cannot, I mean, we need methodologies that are, for the quantitative, we have to unify the methodology, but then the case studies allow us to introduce all the qualitative data, interviews, observation, archives, other written documents, which help us, observation, like observing congresses. So this helps us understand the kind of struggles that are, and of course, core periphery is, I mean, I can say the same thing in France. I mean, most of the publishers are in Paris. It's very clear. If you're not a publisher in Paris, you almost do not exist. So that's yeah. And so now to the OUP India. So this is one of the characteristics of this big global publisher, because Oxford UP exports 40 and Cambridge 40%, something like 30% of their production outside of England, of the UK. I think that's for Cambridge, but so that's the first point. So they think themselves as global publishers, and one way to reach and to achieve the kind of hegemony is to also have, I always forget the word in English, but branches is right, I think. Branches would be right. There is another term which is imprints is right also. It's imprints c'est des marques, but it's branches. It's the one you open in other these. Anyhow, so the relationship between these branches and the mother house, of it's called the maison mère, is very interesting. It's a total power relation usually. I think now Sujata Patel just told me yesterday that I think almost all of these, now the decisions are taken for the publication in Oxford. So what would be published in UP in India, it is decided there. All the decisions have to be submitted. So it's a reduction of the autonomy of these actors. I haven't studied OUP India, but I can tell something about these branches in Latin America, because I have interviewed one of these branches. I won't tell the name of because I don't want to reveal but it was so interesting. I mean, he was the director of the branch, and he said, can you close the door? And then he said, look, it's not only economic domination, it's cultural domination. And then he explained to me that everything that he publishes there, so it was in Chile, it has to reach 40,000 copies so for him to be allowed to sell them outside of Chile, 40,000 copies in Chile. And it has to reach 100,000 copies for him to be able to sell it in Spain. And of course, these requirements are not the same for those who publish in Spain, for the mother, because they export to Latin America. So it's very, very interesting to study. This was not a scholarly publisher, but the power relations, and you can see now if you reduce the autonomy and reduce the number of titles that can be produced, you can see it's a power relation. So of course, they have a margin of, and they can think of an audience, and there are audiences, and there is a discussion that Yves Gingras is promoting the idea that there was a big debate in France because some journals started to publish English translation of the papers, the articles. And there was a big funding for that. It's a huge investment. And Yves Gingras commented and showed that it didn't change much the citation pattern, because not enough to publish in English to be cited in the US. And if you don't publish in the American journals that everybody read in the US, you can publish whatever you want in English, but it won't be read there. And especially maybe read, but not cited. That's also something, because it's not that the ideas do not circulate from the peripheries to the core, but that they're just not acknowledged as being from there, just appropriated. And I have plenty of examples, but yeah, so I think that's a really, really interesting issue that, so Gingras says that there is a dimension in social science that some topics will remain more local. And there is a debate, we had a debate about this, because the question of local and universal interest is also a power relation. I mean, what is published in the US about the US immediately seems to everybody's international universal scope, can be translated. But what is published in India about India is considered as local.
Very good word. I think, I don't know, it is, yeah, but she has another meeting in 5 minutes.
No, let's
yeah, maybe Joël, you are able to read it?
You had a question in the room, so maybe, sorry, maybe in the chat.
Maybe
Whichever I can read.
you can read, and she can quickly ask, and you wanted to ask very quick, very short.
Well, actually, a comment before what you saying.
Let's read this, because this has been posted very.
Okay, so I think the person asked if I could.
There is now a channel for the validation of ideas. For example, what would be a French perspective with respect to works of Ambedkar or Perrier on, say, power structures in societies when it's compared to, say, discussions around contemporary French society?
What would be the French perspective with respect to
works of Ambedkar and Perrier on power structure in societies when compared to the French?
This is the same point that you were making. Will Ambedkar become a global canon?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just if you know, you're talking about Du Bois, but for example, now some people are discovering that Du Bois and America had.
Yes. So that's I think we have to excavate this history. I mean, that's the first step to, and after I have just written a paper about epistemology. Does epistemological decentering implies necessarily relativism, epistemological relativism? And I think no, because this all the knowledge that is produced was transnational from the start and circulated. And then the other day I mentioned Kapil Raj's work and now the new book by Posket about history of science, showing that Copernicus and Newton were not alone, and there were productions in India and in other parts of the world. And so this history has, because otherwise, and more interesting, Kapil Raj has shown that the history of the circulation of science from Europe to other countries is something that was built in the US in 1940 during the war for US to achieve its hegemony on the world. It was totally planned as such, thought as such in Harvard, in other institutions. There was really a plan to make the US the core of the scientific production and scientific circulation of knowledge and kind of monopolization of the history of science.
Thank you very much. Down the green side of the center.
Thanks. Very fancy. Yeah. So, but thanks for the talk. I was also present at the Tuesday talk that you gave on Bourdieu input. There are two sets of comments that I broadly have. And one is, I mean, because it's a bit abstract, I'm trying to think of your Bourdieu work as an illustration for one set of comments, and the subfield of scholarly publication on which we've also had quite an amount of discussion right now as an illustration for the second. So the first one was about how much work, am I audible?
Yeah.
The first set of comments is about how much work you've done on kind of minor practices, which could be either quantitative techniques to study the work of translators, of the classroom as an important situation in which the canon is produced, or in which circulation also takes place. And as well as people who are working, the workers in the scholarly publishing houses or fields or even journal teams and so on. And that was one set of questions. And the second set of questions that I had was related to this particular field, the idea of thinking of these four domains that you mentioned at the beginning as separate subfields and not collapse them together. And in this too, I'm reminded of your work on Bourdieu in particular, because you also bring out like the reasons why one particular book was translated in Korean in two, in two volumes rather than in one, as it was in the French text, and how a lot of it had to do with publishing policies, the publishers' policies. But there is also a tension between this kind of holding these as separate domains, as subfields, and thinking of the circulation as part of the production process itself, which is another kind of, I think I'm sounding more Marxian than, I'm rather thinking of the Marxian idea of circulation being already part of the production process. And if we treat it that way, then a different problem emerges, which would allow us to look at the sort of recursive effects of scholarly publishing on the production of, or the circulation of knowledge itself. And partly some of the examples are these, like when journals of sociological associations are taken over or handed over to these conglomerates, they come up with their own ideas of what counts as international circulation. It's all metric calculations and so on. And the pressures are felt not just on authors on how to write now, but also on journal teams, on what to publish, decisions on what could be read by an international audience versus what will simply be limited to the local and everything. And partly, I mean, a sort of wedge question between these two was about the mechanics, the actual mechanics of translation. And in that too, I was thinking of the recursive loop between scholarly publishing, especially, which I'm treating quite broadly as that, which includes also these, this vast array of self-help groups, like how to teach yourself academic reading, academic writing, that kind of thing. And also the emergence of these fields. It's now coming up in India, but with the domination of English, which has also sort of affected the continent in many ways. It's something very interesting about the kind of English that gets written in it's not just a question of the difference between, say, English and Hindi or Tamil or something, but also the kinds of the Anglophone kind of English that's expected in scholarly writing. Yeah.
1 minute, we have a short commentary, and after that you have
Supreme Court of India has actually commented upon all of this in a line because the works of like Foucault, which is Convention Biopower and Sovereign State Power, actually is, comes from French and then gets translated in English. Supreme Court actually over here, a lot of Indian, jurists and people were studying in the vernacular languages and couldn't catch on to, the various, because like this person rightly mentioned, there's a difference in Indian English and, English that comes from there. So there was a big gap in the understanding when it gets published in French from Foucault to English, and then comes to Indian English and then to the vernacular language. Sometimes it doesn't even get translated. So they actually had a full inspection on that to actually, because it was causing a lot of wrong judgments and miscarriages of justice because of the wrong translation from French to Indian English and getting lost.
Thank you. Now that are fascinating questions. I want. I mean, I don't have answers to everything. It's just a research program, and you're just following up and building the research program. So that's great if we've done that. The common brainstorming. But surely, indirect translation is a topic that is studied in translation studies, and it's of course very important. Even more in literature, strangely. But the issue of the mistranslation is huge, and I've been revising a lot of translations in my life, and it's just, yeah, that's another topic we can talk about very much. And I've interviewed a lot of editors, and you can see the difference between the editor who will tell you that immediately and those who don't mention that. So I think there are the editors who are themselves very aware of that, and they see how come I get the citations of Hegel translated by the translator herself instead, or going to check how Hegel was translated in English before and what is the canonical translation of Hegel. And this is common. I mean, this happened all the time. And when I work with the translator, they say, oh no, I try to translate myself. I said, but we have to go and check the, yeah. And so it's has to do with the translation practices and kind of things you mentioned. So it's of course much more ethnographic study, or there are things done on these things. So you cannot undertake such it needs to be a case study and focus on some things. But of course, it should be part, like what you say about the classroom. And I haven't studied how the canon is taught in the classroom. I know that the students of the EHSS are considering that the sociological canon is too binary. I think some of my colleagues haven't even heard about Rewel Connell, so she could be introduced in the definitely in the syllabus. But yeah, France is always a little late with decisions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.